in their lives, those communities that seem best able to do this are precisely the communities that get demonized and criminalized as a result of not thinking according to the logic of the nation state. I'll give you 2 examples. The first example are smugglers. There are a lot of smugglers in Southeast Asia, and part of my work as an itinerant nomadic academic means following all sorts of itinerant communities in Southeast Asia. While doing fieldwork in North Malaysia and Southern Thailand, I was very much intrigued by the activities of smugglers and the way they lived. Of course, we all know that there is this massive smuggling trade going on between Southern Thailand, Northern Malaysia, and North Sumatra. And that's why, thank God, some of us can get cheap computer programs and DVDs, thanks to them. Now, your average smuggler who starts his day off in the morning having breakfast in Satun in Southern Thailand might then pop over to Langkawi in Malaysia, sell his stuff, and spend the evening in Aceh. He lives in a blurred grey zone where passports, identity cards do not really configure very much in the way in which he sees himself. And in this respect, smugglers, including human smugglers, including illegal immigrants, have exactly that same sort of mentality. I remember many years ago when I was a young activist, I interviewed a quote-unquote illegal immigrant, I don't like this term by the way, an illegal immigrant from Sumatra who came to Malaysia, and he had been detained because he didn't have a passport. So I asked him, in bahasa Indonesia, "Bapak, kenapa tidak ada passport?" And, "Uncle, why don't you have a passport with you?" And his answer was simple, "Ngapain mau paspor? Ya, bapak saya datang nggak ada paspor, kakek saya datang nggak ada paspor, jadi kenapa saya ada paspor? Yeah? Why should I need a passport? My father came without a passport, my grandfather came without a passport." From his point of view, passports were just something that you may or may not have in your baggage as you cross the Malacca Straits. And the Malacca Straits for him was not a dividing line. The Malacca Straits was not a dividing line, but rather a connecting corridor that connected Sumatra with Peninsular Malaysia. And that, I would argue, is a historically correct way to look at the Straits of Malacca. It has always been said that the Straits of Malacca was the corridor that connected 2 rooms, the peninsula of Malaysia and Sumatra. And that's why if you look at the map of Southeast Asia today, I've always found it odd that present-day Malaysia is constituted with Peninsular Malaysia as West Malaysia and Sabah and Sarawak as East Malaysia. Whereas if you were to follow the logic of cultural continuity, Peninsular Malaysia should have been united with Sumatra, because all these communities have shared a common history. When writing the history of the Pan-Malaysian Islamic Party, PAS, I noted that among the 6 first presidents of PAS, 4 of them were descendants of Sumatran migrants. And the same applies to the ruling party, UMNO. There are a lot of quote-unquote Malays today in Malaysia who are descendants of Sumatrans. Now, so that's one community that seems to defy the logic of the nation state. And of course, they get demonized as a result, because nation states don't like mobile subjects that resist neat compartmentalization. There's another group of people who likewise get demonized, and they get a lot of demonization and they get a lot of media attention, and these are terrorists. Terrorists, now I'm sounding like one of the authors of Freakonomics, but terrorists also seem to operate according to a very different logic. As someone, as a political scientist working on security issues, I have to spend some time interviewing these people, and I can tell you it's not always a pleasant experience. But what I find interesting while talking to our homegrown regional terrorists here in Southeast Asia, in the course of interviewing them, one thing pops up: a notion of a regional identity, which is very strongly shared among all of them. So when you have, occasionally you read these alarmist reports in the newspapers, and then you don't go out because you're so scared, But when you read the report, you'll hear people say things like they plan to have a, jihadist state starting from Thailand, Burma, all the way to the Philippines. Well, actually, that is true. That is true. Simply because for them, nation states are irrelevant. Nation states are irrelevant. And as much as we rightfully, correctly, ought to be concerned about the violent aspect of the activities, the logic that guides that activities is nonetheless interesting and should be studied in closer detail, I think. Simply because I've come to the conclusion that perhaps the people who are really at the cutting edge of ASEAN today are precisely those who do not operate according to the logic of ASEAN. Because as we know, ASEAN was created in 1967 as a pact between nation states, governments. But these people think outside the frame of governmentality, beyond the frame of governmentality. So for our concerns today, as we look at Southeast Asia, and we try to somehow reconcile our past with our present and project ourselves into the future, I'm a committed ASEANist, and that's partly out of academic conviction, and partly out of a personal conviction. I won't go too much into my microbiography. I'll just point out that I'm a product of 4-5 generations of interethnic marriages. I am, Javanese, European, Indian, Arab, and as a result of that, even in the history, my private micro-history of my family, I have seen the fact that we have, my ancestors at least, those who came before me, did live in a far more confusing, far more complex Southeast Asia, but also a Southeast Asia that had more opportunity structures for invention and reinvention, and certainly a Southeast Asia that was more relaxed when it came to dealing with complexities within. Nation states today, governments today, have to learn to deal with this. And unfortunately, governments are perhaps not the best tools when it comes to dealing with the complexity of subjects. But if you look at Southeast Asia today, if you look at our communities, the reason why we seem to be in a state of flux all the time is simply because there is this tension between the nation state that still maintains the colonial logic of governmentality, i.e. to colonize its own people in order to control and manage them well, which is not necessarily a bad thing, mind you. The only problem with that is that it is a limited venture that can only go so far but never go beyond. That which always exceeds and spills beyond, spills outside these neat compartments that nation states construct, be they compartments of citizenship or ethnic identity or religious identity. Unfortunately, Southeast Asia today is literally spilling beyond the logic of modern nation states. Now, there have been many people who have already pointed out the limits of the nation state. I mean, when you read the works of people like Basil Davidson, looking at nation states as a curse on Africa. I don't want to go down the path of Basil Davidson and say that the nation state is a curse on Southeast Asia. I certainly don't believe that, because nation states as tools do facilitate certain things. Movement, education, transport, healthcare, social welfare, etc., etc. However, I do feel that nation states also have their limits. As tools, they can only do specific things, in the same way that a scalpel can only do certain things and no more. How then do we reconcile this difference between what states can do and what people aspire and wish for? How do we deal with, reconcile the complexities, the cosmopolitanism that is inherent in the subjectivities of Southeast Asians today? This, I believe, is becoming an increasingly important question that is being faced by political elites all over the region. How do you reconcile people who have multiple overlapping identities simultaneously? Someone having a gender, ethnic, religious identity that may at times be in conflict with each other. Now, nation states can't do that. No nation state can play the pampering role of, counselor and psychotherapist, and that's not the job of the nation state. So I would argue that the future of Southeast Asia, although the nation state will remain playing an important role, but the future of Southeast Asia also can and ought to fall upon the shoulders of artists, but artists in a very specific sense of the word. Now, when I talk about art as playing an important role in how we deal with these issues of identity and difference, I'm talking about art in the Nietzschean sense, art in the sense of a certain creativity, but a creativity which is not simply a case of drawing pretty pictures on the wall or something to sell at IKEA afterwards, but rather art in the sense of a brave art, an attempt to think out of the box. When Nietzsche writes about the philosopher artist, what he means by the philosopher artist is someone who legislates truth, knowing that the truth can only be subjective. We in Southeast Asia today, I think, are at a very interesting juncture in our history, where we the citizens of Southeast Asia, our individual subjectivities, we, the citizens of Southeast Asia, can actually play a role in trying to invent what sort of Southeast Asia we are trying to see. So I go back to the examples I've cited. This process is already taking place. Smugglers, illegal immigrants, and terrorists are already inventing a Southeast Asia that is very different from the Southeast Asia that you see at the ASEAN conferences. There is already a process of a people's ASEAN in the making. We simply have to recognize this for what it is. It is an attempt to redefine regional identity that connects with the past, addresses the complexities of the present, and projects an alternative image into the future. So somehow, this element